This is a map of US-China trade in Africa in 2003. And this is a map of US-China trade in 2023. In a span of 20 years, China has absolutely dominated Africa in terms of trade across the continent. And as if that wasn't enough, China has just made an astonishing announcement for the 53 countries in Africa in terms of trade moving forward. In this video, we're going to break down exactly what China has announced in terms of trade with Africa. And I'm going to put forward statistics, numbers, and my opinion on why I believe the United States is in decline in terms of global influence and impact in the hearts and minds of the rest of the world. Why is all of this important? Because I believe this is the final nail in the coffin, proving that China is now the world's global superpower. And from the African perspective, there's nothing like being best friends with that global superpower. If you're interested in that, stay tuned. For those of you that don't know, my name is TJ and I'm Nigerian and British mixed. On this channel, we talk about African geopolitics. And I think I'm in a place where I'm finally ready to say that America is no longer the greatest superpower on the planet. An analogy for this would be that the United States is Yahoo, a company that was the world's go-to homepage, a company that had the chance to buy Google and passed it up, thinking that Google would never be able to challenge its dominance. But 20 years on from that dominant period, Google is worth several orders of magnitude more than Yahoo. And nobody really uses Yahoo anymore. I mean, it's still alive, it's still there, it still has some use and functionality on the internet. But let's face it, more or less everybody on the internet uses Google over Yahoo. And Yahoo is still living off the glory days of the past. So right now in present day, in the midst of the Trump tariff wars, China announces that it is going to eliminate all tariffs from African exports to China for every single African nation in the continent, more or less. We're talking about a population of 1.4 billion being able to trade tariff-free to a country of a population of over 1 billion. China says it will remove all tariffs on African exports to boost trade. China will negotiate and sign a new economic pact with Africa that will get rid of all tariffs on the 53 African states it has diplomatic ties with, it said, a move that could benefit middle-income nations. The Asian economic giant offers duty and quota-free market access to least developed countries, LDCs, including many in Africa, but the new initiative will level the playing field by also offering middle-income countries similar market access. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't just another trade deal. This is America losing an entire continent. Before this announcement, only 33 African countries had zero tariff access to Chinese markets. Now China is extending this to almost every African nation they have diplomatic ties with. That's 1.4 billion people getting direct access to the world's second largest economy with zero trade barriers. Compare that to America's approach. The African Growth and Opportunity Act gives some African countries duty-free access to US markets, but it comes with conditions, lots of conditions. Countries have to meet American political standards. They face regular reviews. Their access can be suspended if they don't follow American rules about governance and democracy. China's New Deal? No political conditions, no lectures about how to run their countries, just business. The numbers tell the story America doesn't want to face. China-Africa trade hit $295 billion in 2024. That's a 6% increase from the year before. Meanwhile, African countries exported only $30 billion worth of goods to America under AGOA, with just $10.2 billion traded under the duty-free preference. We're looking at a 10-to-1 gap that just got worse. But here's what makes this really significant. Africa's population is set to reach 2.5 billion by 2050. By 2070, that number could hit 3.2 billion. By 2050, 1 in every 3 young people globally will be African. Think about what that means. China just locked in preferential trade access to what will soon be the world's largest consumer market. And they did it while America was busy lecturing African countries about democracy. This isn't just about trade volumes, it's about respect, Every January for over 3 decades, China's foreign minister makes Africa their first international destination. It's not symbolic politics, it's business practice that shows where China's priorities. When was the last time America's Secretary of State made Africa their first stop of the year? When was the last time they visited without bringing a list of demands about governance while offering nothing concrete in return? The contrast becomes clear when you see what China actually builds. Walk through any major African city today, and you'll see Chinese-funded airports, roads, hotels, and shopping centers. Over 10,000 Chinese businesses operate in Africa, representing $300 billion in investments. From Angola to Djibouti, China has poured more than $120 billion through its Belt and Road Initiative to build hydropower plants, roads, and rail lines across the continent. These aren't just statistics. These are airports that connect African cities to global markets. These are ports that allow African goods to reach Asian consumers without going through European middlemen. These are power plants that light up homes and factories. Meanwhile, America's most visible presence across Africa remains military bases. The recent expulsions of American forces from Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso aren't isolated incidents. They represent a broader rejection of Western military presence that offers security solutions to problems often created by Western interference in the first place. Chinese companies announced $112.34 billion in foreign direct investment from 2000 to 2022 and completed $24.60 billion in mergers and acquisitions for projects across Africa. These investments create jobs, build capacity, and connect African economies to global supply chains. Compare this to American aid programs that come with endless conditions about governance, transparency, and democratic reforms. Aid that often requires purchasing American goods with American contractors using American workers, aid that treats symptoms while ignoring the fundamental need for infrastructure and economic development. The Chinese approach is straightforward business. They need resources and markets. Africa has resources and growing markets. They build infrastructure to facilitate trade. Everyone benefits. No lectures about political systems, no demands to choose sides in global conflicts, no threats to withdraw support if African leaders don't adopt Western political models. This matters because African leaders and populations are tired of being treated like children who need Western guidance. They want partners, not patrons. They want investment, not aid. They want respect, not lectures. The Chinese understand this. Their diplomats speak the language of mutual benefit and shared development. They don't arrive with PowerPoint presentations about good governance and democratic institutions. They arrive with blueprints for ports, railways, and power plants. The transformation is visible across the continent. Ethiopia's railway connecting Addis Ababa to Djibouti port was built with Chinese financing and expertise. Kenya's standard gauge railway linking Nairobi to Mombasa was a Chinese project. Ghana's Tema port expansion relied on Chinese investment. Nigeria's Abuja-Kaduna Railway was built by Chinese companies. These aren't just infrastructure projects, they're symbols of a different relationship model, one where African countries are clients rather than supplicants, where development is measured in concrete achievements rather than governance indicators. In 2024, Chinese engagement in Africa's energy sector approached $40 billion, the highest level since 2017. China's engagement in green energy reached a record $11.8 billion. China is helping Africa leapfrog directly to renewable energy while America debates climate policy. But perhaps the most significant shift is psychological. A generation of African leaders and professionals now sees China as the primary example of rapid development without Western political systems. They see a country that lifted hundreds of millions from poverty through pragmatic economic policies rather than democratic reforms. This challenges the fundamental Western narrative that political liberalization must come before economic development. China's success, and now its partnership with Africa, offers an alternative model where economic growth can happen within different political frameworks. American policymakers struggle to understand this shift because they can't imagine African countries making rational choices to partner with China. Instead, they speak of Chinese debt traps and authoritarian influence as if African leaders can't evaluate partnership offers and choose what serves their interests. This attitude reflects the colonial mindset that African leaders and populations are rejecting. The assumption that Africa should automatically prefer Western partnership because of shared values ignores the reality that those shared values often came with exploitation, extraction, and conditional assistance. The debt trap narrative reveals Western hypocrisy. Western institutions have been lending to African countries for decades with strict conditions, structural adjustment programs, and requirements to privatize public services. When China offers infrastructure loans without political conditions, suddenly debt becomes a concern for Western policymakers, who never seemed worried about IMF and World Bank conditions that devastated African economies in the 1980s and 1990s. African leaders aren't naive about Chinese loans. They're making calculated decisions that Chinese infrastructure financing offers better terms and more tangible benefits than Western alternatives. They can see the roads, ports, and power plants that Chinese investment creates. They can compare this to decades of Western aid that produced endless reports but limited infrastructure. The military dimension adds another layer to America's declining influence. China has one base in Africa, opened in Djibouti in 2017 for anti-piracy and trade protection. One base focused on protecting trade routes versus multiple American bases that increasingly look like tools for political control rather than mutual security. Recent developments in the Sahel region prove this point. Military coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger were followed by demands for American and French forces to leave. These weren't pro-Chinese coups. They were anti-Western reactions to decades of military intervention that failed to provide security while maintaining foreign control over domestic politics. China didn't need to orchestrate these developments. They simply offered an alternative partnership model that doesn't require hosting foreign military bases or accepting foreign political interference. African countries found this more attractive than continued Western military presence that came with lectures about democracy while failing to provide actual security. The technology sector shows similar patterns. Chinese companies like Huawei, Tecno, and Infinix dominate African mobile phone markets, not because of government subsidies, but because they offer affordable, reliable products designed for African conditions. They manufacture locally, employ African workers, and provide after-sales service networks that Western companies often neglect. American companies, when they engage with African markets at all, typically focus on high-end consumers in major cities. Chinese companies build products and services for mass markets. They understand that economic development requires broad-based access to technology and communication tools, not just premium products for urban elites. China now hosts more African students than any other country. These students return home with technical skills, language abilities, and professional networks that facilitate business relationships between Chinese and African companies. They become bridges for technology transfer, trade relationships, and mutual understanding. American educational programs for African students often focus on liberal arts, governance studies, and development economics, rather than the technical and engineering schools that African countries need for industrialization. This reflects a broader American assumption that Africa's primary need is better governance rather than technical capacity. The agricultural sector demonstrates Chinese pragmatism versus American ideology. Chinese companies invest in African agriculture to secure food supplies and create export opportunities. They bring seeds, equipment, and technical expertise designed to increase productivity and crop yields. They focus on practical results rather than environmental or social impact assessments. American agricultural programs often emphasize sustainable practices, gender equality, and small farmer support while providing limited technical assistance or market access. These may be worthy goals, but they don't address the immediate need to increase agricultural productivity and rural incomes. During COVID-19, China provided vaccines to African countries, while America and Europe initially restricted exports to protect their own populations. Chinese pharmaceutical companies now manufacture generic drugs in African countries, while American companies focus on patent protection and premium pricing. Even climate change responses reveal different approaches. China invests in renewable energy projects that provide immediate benefits to African communities while creating export opportunities for Chinese technology companies. American climate programs often focus on carbon credits, biodiversity conservation, and environmental monitoring rather than energy access and industrial development. The cumulative effect is clear. China engages with Africa as a business partner interested in mutual economic growth. America engages with Africa as a development client that needs guidance, conditions, and supervision. African countries increasingly prefer the Chinese approach because it treats them as equals capable of making their own decisions about development priorities and political systems. They're tired of Western lectures about corruption, democracy, and human rights that seem to ignore Western corporations' own involvement in resource extraction and tax avoidance. The sovereignty dimension is crucial. African countries spent decades fighting for independence from colonial rule. They didn't win that independence to accept new forms of conditional sovereignty from international financial institutions and development agencies. China's approach, whatever its limitations, at least recognizes African countries as sovereign entities capable of making their own choices. This doesn't mean African countries are uncritical of Chinese practices. Local communities sometimes protest Chinese projects. African governments sometimes renegotiate loan terms. African civil society organizations raise concerns about labor practices and environmental standards. But these are discussions between partners rather than lectures from patrons. The economic data supports this transformation. African countries that have strengthened ties with China show higher GDP growth rates, increased manufacturing capacity, and improved infrastructure quality compared to countries that remain primarily dependent on Western aid and investment. Looking forward, this trend will accelerate unless America fundamentally changes its approach to Africa. China's announcement to eliminate all tariffs on African exports represents exactly the kind of concrete, immediate benefit that African countries value. America's response will likely be more lectures about Chinese intentions rather than competing offers of genuine partnership benefits. The generational shift matters too. Young African leaders who studied in China, worked with Chinese companies, or grew up seeing Chinese-built infrastructure are less susceptible to Western warnings about Chinese influence. They judge partnerships based on results rather than ideology. American policymakers can continue to dismiss this as African naivety or Chinese manipulation. But this attitude only accelerates the shift away from Western partnership. African countries are making rational choices based on their development priorities and sovereignty interests. Refusing to acknowledge this reality makes American policy less effective, not more principled. Here's what America is losing. Africa's urban population is expected to nearly triple by 2050 to 1.34 billion. That's 1.34 billion potential consumers who will have preferential access to Chinese goods and services. 1.34 billion people who will grow up in cities built with Chinese infrastructure, connected by Chinese technology, powered by Chinese energy systems. When These young Africans start businesses. Who do you think they'll partner with? When they need technology, where will they look first? When they have resources to export, which markets will be most accessible? China positioned itself early as Africa's primary partner in this growth story. America positioned itself as Africa's supervisor and conditional supporter. The results of these different approaches are now clear in trade statistics, infrastructure projects, and diplomatic relationships across the continent. This brings me to a point that American foreign policy experts don't want to discuss. I believe the United States is no longer the world's dominant superpower. Even if you think I'm wrong about that today, look at these numbers and tell me how long America can maintain that position. Africa's population will reach 2.5 billion by 2050 and 4.5 billion by 2100. China just secured preferential trade access to all of this growth. Meanwhile, America continues to treat Africa like a charity case that should be grateful for Western attention. By 2050, nearly 40% of the world's young people will be African. They'll be connected to Chinese supply chains, educated in Chinese universities, working with Chinese technology, and living in cities built with Chinese infrastructure. When this generation takes power across Africa, which superpower do you think they'll align with? This isn't just about Africa becoming more prosperous, it's about Africa becoming more influential in global affairs. Countries with growing economies want respect, not supervision. They want partnerships that recognize their sovereignty, not aid programs that treat them as clients. China understands this. America doesn't. The consequences extend far beyond Africa. As African countries become more prosperous and influential, their partnership preferences will shape global alliances, trade routes, and political alignments. America's declining influence in Africa represents a broader challenge to Western dominance in international relations. But here's what excites me about all of this. Africa is finally getting the partnerships it deserves. For too long, African countries were told they had to choose between poverty and accepting Western political systems. China is proving that's a false choice. African countries can develop their economies, build infrastructure, and improve living standards while maintaining their own political systems and cultural values. They can be equal partners in global trade rather than junior members dependent on Western goodwill. This new trade agreement isn't just good for China, it's transformational for Africa. Imagine what happens when African manufacturers can sell directly to Chinese consumers without tariffs. Imagine the jobs created when Chinese companies set up production facilities in Africa to serve both local and global markets. Imagine the technology transfer when Chinese companies invest in African universities and research centers. Imagine the innovation that happens when young African entrepreneurs have direct access to Chinese capital and expertise. With Africa's urban population nearly tripling by 2050, we're talking about the largest economic transformation in human history. Cities growing from thousands to millions of residents, infrastructure projects that dwarf anything built in the 20th century, consumer markets that will rival North America and Europe combined. China positioned itself to benefit from this transformation. America positioned itself to lecture about it. The military withdrawal from several African countries should serve as a wake-up call. When countries ask American forces to leave, it's not because they prefer Chinese authoritarianism. It's because American military presence has become associated with political interference rather than security cooperation. China doesn't need military bases to maintain influence in Africa because its influence is based on economic relationships that benefit both sides. American influence has relied too heavily on military presence and conditional aid that creates dependence rather than partnership. The path forward for America would require acknowledging that African countries are capable of choosing their own partners based on their own interests. It would require offering concrete economic benefits rather than political lectures. It would require treating African leaders as equals rather than clients. But this fundamental shift seems unlikely given American political culture and institutional inertia. The American foreign policy establishment remains convinced that Africa should appreciate Western values and partnership models regardless of practical outcomes. This conviction blinds them to the obvious reasons why African countries increasingly prefer Chinese alternatives. The result is a continental shift that will reshape global economic and political relationships for generations. Africa's population will double by 2050, its economy will continue growing, its natural resources will become more valuable, its markets will become more important. China positioned itself early as Africa's primary partner in this growth story. America positioned itself as Africa's supervisor and conditional supporter. The results of these different approaches are now clear in trade statistics, infrastructure projects, and diplomatic relationships across the continent. This isn't a story about Chinese success as much as American failure to adapt to a changing world where African countries have choices about their partnerships and development paths. America could have offered genuine partnership, unconditional trade benefits, and massive infrastructure investment. Instead, it offered lectures, conditions, and military presence. African sovereignty is not a threat to global stability. It's the natural result of successful independence movements and economic development. Countries that treat African sovereignty with respect will benefit from partnership opportunities. Countries that continue to expect African deference will find themselves increasingly isolated from one of the world's fastest growing regions. The shift from America to China in Africa represents more than changing trade statistics. It represents African countries asserting their right to choose partnerships based on their own interests rather than Western expectations. And for Africa, this is just the beginning. We're witnessing the rise of a continent that refused to accept the false choice between development and sovereignty, a continent that found partners willing to invest in its future rather than lecture about its past. The numbers don't lie, the infrastructure is real, the partnerships are working, and Africa's best days are ahead. At least, that's what China's investment in the continent reflects. So what do you guys think out there? I'm sure many of you have opinions. Please feel free to put them in the comments. But if you have nothing to say, would it be too much for me to ask you to write the words "Free Trade Africa" in the comment section? It just lets me know that you've watched the video to the end, you like what I'm doing, and you want me to continue. Thanks so much for watching this video today, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.